This is the month 1 update for my new Filterless Walstad Method Betta fish tank, where I'll be sharing everything that happens in the tank over the next 12 months from an over-the-shoulder perspective. So getting right in with the tank setup, and I'm using a 30 litre or 8 US gallon portrait shaped tank from an AQUARIUMS shrimp set kit, but I won't be using any of the other accessories that came with it. These AQUARIUMS tanks come with a visible logo on the glass, so I turned it to the side and then added an optional privacy film to the back of the tank to improve the aesthetics. Next, I added a 1/2 inch layer of Westland topsoil, a popular brand here in the UK, and this specific formula is completely free from additives, chemicals and fertilizers. I shaped the soil based on my hardscape layout so the rocks would sit directly on the gravel layer where the soil was intentionally left out. This method can reduce the nutrients released into the water column at the start of a build, but it's not essential, and most of my Walstad Method tanks are fully covered with topsoil across the entire base plate. I needed to cap the soil to prevent the nutrients and fine particles from leaching into the water column consistently, and to do this I added around 1 inch of gravel. I usually go with the finer gravel, which has a grain size of around 2 mm, which is my preferred option, but this time I went with a similar product from the same brand which has a grain size of 4 mm. In my experience, this larger variety does hold on to its colour better once it's submerged, but one annoying thing about this product is that both the 2 mm and 4 mm sizes come in identical packaging, making it difficult to know which one you're getting if you order them online. For the hardscape, I placed 3 pieces of black lava rock into the tank, arranging them to provide a hiding spot near the back of the tank for the Betta to retreat to if it wants to get out of view. I'm a big fan of lava rock as it's affordable, it looks great, and its porous texture boosts surface area for beneficial microorganisms. This allows for some additional surface area for biological filtration in the tank in case there's any problems, but with the plant selection I'm using for this, it really shouldn't be an issue. I also had 2 leftover pieces of spiderwood from a previous scape that I couldn't find a use for elsewhere, so I added them to this tank. The idea is that they'll look like roots hanging down from a tree above the waterline on a river's surface, but I needed to use them somewhere. Finally, I added just enough water to submerge the substrate layers of the tank, and I find this makes planting easier while also working any trapped gas out of the soil that's in the tank. Moving on to planting, and I'll leave a full plant list in the video's description. At this stage, I do like to unpack all of my plants and trim any damaged or overly long roots as required. It just tends to save time as it lets you do the trimming on the plants while the water is also working the trapped air out of the substrate. I'm starting to prefer to plant the mid-ground of the tank first with Walstad Method tanks, as it gives you a better idea of the available space for your background plants, which will be the natural filters. This first plant is Echinodorus Aquartica, which is a compact sword that's perfect for smaller tanks like this one, and will add extra cover and hiding spots for the Betta. Next, I started to plant some Limnophila Sessiliflora in the background of the tank, and this will be the primary filtration plant in this setup as its fast growth rate absorbs large amounts of nutrients and toxins from the water column. Then I added some more Limnophila Sessiliflora to the other side of the hardscape, and from this angle you can see the small cave-like hiding spot that I mentioned earlier at the back of the tank for the Betta to tuck itself away into if it wants. After that, I planted some Rotala Blood Red in front of the Limnophila, and it's worth noting both the colour of its leaves at this stage as well as the height of the stems. I am new to this plant, but I've been really impressed so far, and to my knowledge this is the regular version of Rotala Blood Red, not Rotala Blood Red SG Singapore. In my experience, it's been just as easy to grow as Ludwigia Mini Super Red, but I do think it's probably a better choice for beginners who want to get a red plant in their tank. Then I added Monte Carlo to the foreground to act as a carpeting plant for the tank, but in hindsight, adding this at this stage was probably a mistake, but more on that later. Next, I added some Cryptocoryne Beckettii Petchii behind the Monte Carlo in the line with the rocks just to add some detailing. This is a great little dwarf Cryptocoryne variety which is perfect for nano tanks in my experience. I also wanted to add some detail and colour to the hardscape, so I added some Bucephalandra Red between two of the rocks, but it's likely that this might just stay green despite the name. On the other side of the tank, I also added some Schismatoglottis Prietoi to the rocks. Higher up on the rocks, I added some Bolbitis Heudelotii, which can provide additional cover and hiding spots for the betta fish as it grows in. I did get a second rhizome in the pot, so I added that to the back of the rock to add some more cover there, but I'm not sure if I leave that one in. I did add a second piece of Schismatoglottis Prietoi to the top of the rock too, but I don't seem to have recorded it, but you can see it in this clip. This is what the tank is looking like at this stage of the build, with the taller plants in the background, and then everything's organised by height layer moving forward. With the planting complete, it was time to fill the tank with water, and I always use regular tap water as my water source, but I do use a dechlorinator to treat any chlorine or chloramine in the tank which may harm the beneficial microorganisms which are added via the soil. This is what the tank looked like filled with water, and I know the stem plants in the back look a little strange because they're all lopsided. This is completely normal, it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong, and they'll start to grow towards the light source over the coming days. To finish off the planting, I added some red root floaters to the surface of the tank. I keep my betta fish tanks at 27 degrees Celsius or 81 degrees Fahrenheit, and for this setup I'm using a Fluval T-Series heater with a Echinodorus A2 light, but more affordable lights can definitely run the majority of the plants in this setup, and I link to some alternatives in the description. Moving on, and we get to how the tanks actually perform during its first month, which is usually the most volatile month with any Walstad tank setup. These are the water parameters 24 hours after the initial setup, and ammonia was shown 0.5 ppm, which is normal for the specific soil I use. Yours may be slightly higher or lower depending on the soil that you have. I haven't added any bottled ammonia to kickstart the cycle with this either. All of the ammonia is just naturally being released from the topsoil in the bottom of the tank. By day 2, I was already getting a nitrite reading, which isn't normal for this type of tank, and I do suspect that one of the plants that I added had a lot of microorganisms on it that's converting the toxic ammonia into the toxic nitrite, and that's why I'm getting a hit so early. I also started my water change routine on day 2 by doing a 50% partial water change in the tank. This is partly to remove excess nutrients being released by the soil, but I also wanted to get easy access to the heater to slightly reposition it so it would look better in the tank. By day 4, my Rotala Blood Red had already started showing the red hues that it's well known for, which was impressive as most red plants usually take longer to colour up in my tanks. One issue that I did notice early on was this cloudy area near the bottom of the tank, and if you're doing a Walstad Method tank with no sources of active flow such as a water pump or a filter, this is something that you should watch out for during the first month. My guess is that it's just a build-up of excess nutrients in the tank, and I always try to target these spots when siphoning water for my water change and remove them as often as possible. But in other tanks, I have found that if you leave them too long, they can start to cause some of your plants to start melting, so I always recommend you get rid of it as soon as possible. Unfortunately, it was too late for the Monte Carlo, and I do think this is a more delicate plant, at least when it's in a tissue culture cup rather than the potted version. This is actually one of the reasons I am considering holding off on adding tissue culture cups to my future Walstad Method tanks until month 2, when the bulk of the water-soluble nutrients has already leached out of the soil and things are a lot more stable. Aside from the Monte Carlo, everything else in the tank, including the Cryptocoryne Beckettii Petchii, which was also in that cloudy patch, seemed to be growing fine. Fast forward to day 14 and there's no detectable ammonia or nitrite on my test kit, which will be largely due to the Limnophila Sessiliflora using a lot of the excess nutrients for growth. The Rotala Blood Red has also been grown at an impressive rate in this tank too, so I do think that'll be helping with the natural filtration. But despite regular removal, for the first few weeks that cloudy buildup did keep coming back, and the Monte Carlo did eventually melt, and I just removed the remaining plant manually. On the other hand, the Cryptocoryne Beckettii Petchii, which was in its potted form when I got that, was consistently pushing out new leaves during the first month despite being in that cloudy patch of water. With the two new Walstad tanks I've set up since this one, I have chose to add some USB water pumps just to get some active sources of water flow in the tank. So far this does seem to make a massive difference because these pumps are helping to circulate the nutrient-rich water to force it to come into contact with the plants, increasing contact time and frequency, letting them absorb the excess nutrients naturally to prevent the cloudy water build-up. By day 21, the growth of both the Limnophila Sessiliflora and Rotala Blood Red were very noticeable, and the Monte Carlo had fully melted away by this point. There is some algae grown on the driftwood, which is normal at this stage and is actually a good sign showing that life is naturally starting to build up in the new ecosystem you've just built. Now there is a lot of nutrients released from even topsoil with this type of tank during the first month, and on top of that I'm also running a Echinodorus A2 light at full intensity, which in hindsight is probably a mistake and has accelerated the algae growth. I also had this water lettuce which I'd had in a little quarantine tub for a few weeks. I originally took this from another tank that I have that has duckweed and ram's horn snails in it, and I didn't want either getting into this tank, so I did quarantine it for about a week. Water lettuce is easily one of the top 3 plants for natural water purification in my experience, and it makes a surprising difference in almost any setup when you add it when it comes to nutrient control. As you can see, I'm adding 4 water lettuce plants on day 21, and it is important to remember this just to prove a point later in the video. Another reason I'm such a big fan of Limnophila Sessiliflora is that unlike a lot of stem plants that require trimming to encourage new stem growth, Limnophila will just start throwing up new stems after a few weeks of planting if conditions are good. These new stems are basically additional plant mass that you're getting for natural filtration to help keep the water parameters safe and stable in the tank. By day 28 there was still no detectable ammonia or nitrite in the tank, and the plants were clearly doing their job, absorbing as much nutrients as possible from the water. This is what the tank looked like at this stage, and the water lettuce had exploded in growth, and you can see all of the roots hanging down from the surface from the plants just dominating the surface area. Now remember how I said I added just 4 plants on day 21, and this is what it looked like on day 28 with 14 plants on the surface with little plantlets shooting off on their runners. This is why water lettuce is so good at natural water purification. Not only is all of the new plant mass also helping to naturally purify the water, but it was also created by toxic compounds being removed from the water for new plant growth, be it nitrogen compounds or other ions that count towards your total dissolved solid count. All that extra plant mass was created using excess nutrients, be it nitrogen compounds or other total dissolved solid ions that would otherwise build up in the tank and potentially harm your fish, shrimp and snails. This is what the tank is looking like today, and I haven't done any trimming yet as I wanted to document how much plant growth the plants actually can do in such a short period of time. That said, the water lettuce definitely needs thinning back soon, and I'll be moving some of it over to my 40-gallon tank to help balance the nutrient parameters there. Both the Limnophila Sessiliflora and Rotala Blood Red are also ready for a trimming session too. I will probably replant some of the Limnophila trimmings back into the tank, but with the side stems coming through it's going to naturally fill out the background of the tank on its own. As for the Rotala, I'll probably replant all of the trimmings, or at least as many as them that I can get back into the tank as possible, just because I do want a nice clump of red plants on the right hand side. The rest of the plants are all doing well so far, and I am happy with how the tank's progressing. I am planning to reintroduce Monte Carlo to the foreground at month 3, ideally from a potted plant rather than an in vitro plant because they do tend to be more resilient. The red root floaters have started to turn red on the surface and I do really like their look, but it is worth noting that there's a lot of algae forming on the surface of the tank. I think there's 2 main reasons for this, and first, the Echinodorus A2 light is by far the most powerful light I've used, and running it on full intensity from the start was a mistake. Second, the tank currently only has passive water flow caused by small temperature differences in the tank. Since it's a British summer, the ambient temperature in my fish room is averaging 25 degrees Celsius and the tank is set to 27 degrees Celsius, so there's not that much convection-based movement happening. In hindsight, adding an affordable USB water pump from the very beginning probably could have helped with this, but it's all part of the learning process. I do plan to do a cleanup on the tank soon and manually remove as much of the algae as possible. Some of the Echinodorus Aquartica leaves are starting to brown, but I believe this is just the plant choosing to melt those leaves back rather than convert them to the submerged form. There are some new submerged leaves grown in already, and this can be normal for some rosette plants like Echinodorus, Cryptocoryne and Lagonodendra. Speaking of crypts, my Cryptocoryne Beckettii Petchii is pushing out a good amount of new growth, so it should thrive. This helps to reinforce my theory that the cloudy water buildup from earlier, which took out the Monte Carlo, mainly only affects delicate plants, especially those that started in the in vitro tissue culture cups because they take time to strengthen up. I don't have any plans to add fish to the tank during month 2 because a friend of mine has a breeding pair of Betta and Bellis and they've recently spawned, so I'd love to add one of the wild type Betta fish to this tank once it's old enough. Ideally, a male from that spawn will end up grown out and I can document its entire journey in this tank from being a tiny little juvenile fish to adulthood. I am considering adding Armano shrimp, Neocaridina shrimp and horned neurite snails in the coming weeks depending on availability in my area. I already have thriving colonies of cherry, Bloody Mary and yellow Neocaridina shrimp, so I am thinking of getting a new colour for this tank, probably white snowballs. I just think that tiny little white shrimp will contrast really nicely in this setup against the black substrate and hardscape, but that may also make them easier for the Betta fish to hunt. Horned neurite snails are excellent little algae eaters too, but they are very difficult to find in my area right now, but if I can't find them I'll just add some more Armano shrimp instead. As always with bettas, there's a chance it might start to eat the shrimp in its aquarium, so I'll keep a close eye on things when introducing the betta, and if needed I'll move the shrimp out of that tank into one of my other tanks to keep them safe. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching and good luck with your Walstad Method tanks. The month 2 update for this one should be online around this time next month.